Thank you very much and good morning. I will be speaking about the cases of two Emirati women who have been arbitrarily detained in the UAE since 2015. Those are the cases of Amina Alabdouli, who is a 40-year-old teacher and a mother of 5 children, and the case of Maryam Albalushi, who is 24 years old and was a student at the College of Technology in the city of Kalba in the UAE. Why did I choose to introduce these two cases? Because first of all, we know a lot of details about the two cases. I will explain about that later. And secondly, because they illustrate very well the familiar pattern that Oscar and Ines have already outlined of practices such as arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances and secret detention, torture during interrogations, the use of forced confessions, and prosecution under extremely vague and broadly worded legislation purely for the exercise of human rights. And then, of course, once convicted, terrible, inhumane prison conditions and ill treatment in prison. Both women were arrested in 2015. As mentioned. Ms. Alabdouli was accused of damaging the reputation of the state under the cybercrime law of 2012. This was in connection to a series of tweets that she denies posting. And Ms. Albalushi was accused of financing terrorism under the 2015 anti-terrorism law for sending a donation of $600 to a Syrian family in 2014. How were they arrested? This has already been mentioned, a very, very similar, familiar pattern. They were arrested in the middle of the night without a warrant by plainclothes officers of the security forces at their homes and simply whisked away. They were then taken to a secret detention location. They were not informed of the reason for their arrests or their charges until many months after their arrests. In secret detention, they were held incommunicado. So they were not allowed to contact their families, who had no idea where they were taken, and neither did they have access to legal counsel. As is often the case in secret detention, those two prisoners were tortured. They were beaten, tied up, stripped naked, forced to stand for many hours, and other techniques. During interrogation, they were both forced to sign confessions. In Ms. Alabdouli's case, she was forced to sign a written confession with her fingerprint under threats of violence. And in Ms. Albalushi's case, she was given a document and was told that this is a document concerning her transfer to a different prison, which she signed but was not allowed to read, and which was later presented in court as a confession. Both confessions were admitted into evidence by the courts, and this is a systemic problem in the UAE. The UAE does, on the one hand, not have sufficient laws regulating the use of or the admission into evidence of confessions, which makes it very, very difficult to demand that they be excluded from evidence. But more importantly, I would argue, the judiciary is, as was already pointed out, not independent or impartial. The judiciary is under the de facto control of the government. So when both women claimed during their trials that they did not make these confessions, that they were coerced into it or forced to sign them, the court simply ignored these claims. And similarly, both women made allegations of torture during their trials, which was similarly ignored by the court, and no investigations into these allegations were launched, as far as we know. This is, of course, a further indication of the lack of independence of the court, not to launch an investigation into torture claims. Both women were eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison. In Ms. Alabdouli's case, she was tried before the State Security Chamber of the Federal Supreme Court. So this is part of the special jurisdiction that Ines has already talked about. In her case was a cybercrime case, but nonetheless, she was tried as first and last instance in front of this special jurisdiction court as part of the Supreme Court, which what this means is that she was denied the right to appeal the decision. Ms. Albalushi was given the right to appeal the sentence, but the Supreme Court upheld the 5-year prison sentence. In 2016, they were both transferred to Al-Wafba prison, which is in Abu Dhabi. And in Al-Wafba, they became cellmates and became friends and started to record voice messages together secretly and write letters together. And these voice messages and letters were smuggled out of prison and became public and were published. And in these testimonies, they describe their cases, the treatment that they have been subjected to, and also more broadly, the prison conditions in Al-Wafba prison. And for these prison conditions, they mentioned, for example, that cells that were made for 6 inmates hold almost 3 times as many women. Women are therefore forced to share beds or sleep on the floor, that the cells are infested with cockroaches, that there are insects in food regularly, that the water appears and are very moldy, and also that they are subjected to arbitrary and humiliating strip searches, sometimes in the middle of the night, and other humiliating practices such as video cameras in bathrooms. For these testimonies and their endeavors to raise public awareness around their cases, they faced harsh reprisals by the UAE authorities. In 2019, they were brought before the state security prosecution, and 3 further charges were leveled against them. These charges were in direct relation to their testimonies, and were all along the lines of damaging the reputation of the UAE and Al-Wafba prison authorities and spreading false information. I'd like to remind you that they were given 5-year sentences and arrested in 2015, so they would have been due for release last year. They remain in prison because of these further charges. Another reprisal against their activism, if you will, is that they were put into solitary confinement in early 2020. They were put into solitary confinement every Sunday, Monday, and Thursdays, which are the days that they were allowed to use the telephone to contact their families. And thereby the UAE authorities completely cut them off from contact with their families and the outside world. To protest against this treatment, both women decided to go on hunger strike despite their already very poor health. And that was in February. And then in March of 2020, Maryam Albalushi attempted suicide by cutting a vein in her arm. She was taken to the clinic of the prison and she survived. But despite this clear evidence that their mental and physical health has deteriorated drastically since their imprisonment, neither woman has given medical treatment apart from when Ms. Albalushi was taken to the clinic after her suicide attempt. And their health is very, very bad. We are very, very concerned after the hunger strike and also as a result of the beatings. Ms. Alabdouli has detailed, for example, that she has lost vision on one eye, most likely due to the beatings. And Ms. Alabdouli has constant stomach pains. So we are very, very concerned. And the lack of medical care in Emirati prisons is notorious. Lastly, I would like to talk about a recent opinion published by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which was published in November of last year, and which found that the detentions in both cases were arbitrary. This includes the initial arrest and detention, as well as their ongoing detention beyond the end of their sentences. The working group also stated that the sending of video recordings and letters to UN Special Procedures mandate holders falls under the right to freedom of expression and opinion, and that therefore the further charges that were brought against them are clear reprisals against the two women's attempts to seek the assistance of the international community. I will conclude here. I hope that I could give a good overview over the violations in these cases, and not so much because these two cases are horrific, but because they really indicate systemic problems in the UAE when it comes to human rights, when it comes to the disregard for due process, when it comes to unfair trials, and of course the lack of independence of the judiciary. And anyone caught up in this system, whether Emirati or foreign national, a UK national, is basically placed outside the protection of the law. And it is a very, very dangerous system to be caught up in. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions.